New journalist for sale. My name is Diego Ramos. Today, with my colleague Max Jones, we will be talking with Carey Shenkman, the attorney, author, litigator who specializes in civil and human rights, comes on to talk about the newest chapter in the history of the Espionage Act involving former President Donald Trump and the overstay of classified documents in his Mar-a-Lago bathroom. If there was anyone to give us the breakdown of what this means and the implications and the precedent it sets, it's the author of the book that explains the 100-year plus history of this awful law. And the book is called A Century of Repression, Espionage Act, and Freedom of the Press, by the way. And it was co-written by Ralph Engelman. So be sure to check it out. Thanks for watching, as always. And remember to like, comment, subscribe to battle the damn algorithm. All right. Hi, Carey. Thanks for joining us on Journalists for Sale.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So, just to get into it, as an attorney and author on the Espionage Act with your book with Ralph Engelman called A Century of Repression, what was your reaction to hearing about a former president being charged with the Espionage Act? And can you explain a little bit, given the history of the act and why this is so important and unprecedented?
I was blown away to see the charges against Trump, not because of the pursuit of a former president. There's actually precedent for going after at least a presidential candidate under the Espionage Act. That's happened before, although it was a long time ago. But I was surprised at just how stupid Trump was and the amount of chances that he had to make it right, because he got a lot of chances. So taking a step, two steps back. So I've been working on issues and analysis surrounding the Espionage Act for close to 10 years, and recently co-authored a book on the 100-year history, now at this point over 100-year history of this law. And with the Donald Trump case, he's accused of retaining a number of highly sensitive national security documents, things that allegedly concern nuclear secrets, war plans, high level stuff. And what a lot of folks did was jump to comparing what's happening to Trump to what's happened to whistleblowers who provide information to the press because they want to expose some evidence of waste, fraud, abuse, or policy missteps. All these cases happen under the Espionage Act. So when we're talking about Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, these cases where insiders are talking to the press and then get prosecuted and sent to jail, those are Espionage Act cases. And I think a lot of folks right now are confused because this law is called the Espionage Act, but all those things don't look like espionage as you or I would understand that word. So even though Trump was an idiot and was keeping boxes of documents in his bathroom and in his ballroom, I think those photos have been circulated and folks are talking about that. Trump was an idiot, but I don't think anyone's accusing him of, at least accusing him credibly of being a spy. I think so. Maybe there's some theories and accusations. Oh, is he working with the Russians or something? But I think the narrative right now is that Trump was reckless. I think that's been the reporting, but it doesn't look like espionage. And then the cases of, say, Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, and now with prosecution of a publisher, Julian Assange, those aren't spy cases either. There are folks on the political spectrum who call those defendants traitors, but that's different than a classic espionage case where somebody is being paid in secret by a foreign power to try to collect and distribute secrets. So I think that's part of the confusion around this case, is that it's a game of names. It's kind of the shell game, because this law called the Espionage Act is being used for all this stuff that doesn't sound like espionage, and we can get into the meat of that. But that was really my first reaction was, what the hell? Because at least for his prosecution, it seemed totally avoidable, and he walked right into it.
So you're saying that because of how he was given, how the documents that he had were requested to be given to the DOJ like multiple times, and he didn't, and he ignored it, right? Is that what you're
One
referring to
hundred
when you call him
percent.
reckless?
Yeah, in all the cases that I looked at, that we looked at in writing our book, and
Oh, shit.
under President Obama, and then what I was really surprised by was the leniency that was given to Trump. So we looked at a lot of cases for our book on the Espionage Act. And the cases really escalated under President Obama and, ironically, under President Trump. Obama and Trump prosecuted more insider sources to the media under the Espionage Act than all presidents combined. There's a lot of irony in how this law being used against Trump. So the one thing I've never seen was insiders being given chances. When folks are typically caught with documents that they take home, even if they're not keeping them in a place that's available to others, even if the documents aren't sensitive, they're not given second chances. They're not given a chance to return those documents. It goes to an indictment. Usually there's a raid and then an indictment. So that part, actually, this negotiation back and forth, was what surprised me, and a large part of what he's getting prosecuted for. It's not just the documents, but it's these counts of obstruction of justice and not cooperating with authorities when they actually had process. Because under the Espionage Act, there is an obligation to return documents upon the request of an official, which he apparently flat out refused to do.
Yeah, I mean, so that's kind of interesting that you bring up this like leniency that Trump got because I think that a narrative that I'm hearing a lot and that I kind of agree with, but I guess I'm wondering how um, this either goes with that theory or contradicts with it, that this is politically motivated prosecution of Trump. Because when you look at similar cases like David Petraeus and Sandy Berger and Hillary Clinton and even Joe Biden recently, it's kind of hard to like understand what's so much different about Trump's case that he wouldn't just get slapped down with like a misdemeanor charge like I think Petraeus was. And I think I don't know if Sandy Berger was I got a misdemeanor or if it was just Petraeus, but like just a slap on the wrist basically. But like when you bring up this leniency, like what were they? What was DOJ thinking? Did they not want to prosecute him, but then it was embarrassing, so they had to in their eyes, or is it just completely politically motivated, or is it kind of hard to speculate as to what exactly was going on with this leniency?
What I What I suspect is that the back and forth and refusal was very decisive here. And I think also just the astonishing recklessness with the documents. So, how I've seen that needle being threaded, at least in some of the commentary, is that other folks like Biden and Clinton were cooperating when they got basically caught with their pants down, but there was some attempt to mitigate, whereas Trump was simply being bullheaded. And I think also with Trump, there was a degree of objective recklessness involved. I think you could argue the same with things like the Clinton email server and some of the double standards that are applied. But really, the photos speak for themselves. The documents held in a bathroom and in a ballroom. I mean, it's really just a reckless disregard. So I think in many ways, his conduct backed them into a corner where if they didn't do something to enforce, I think it would have actually, I think not going after him would likely have been perceived as more political. Like I don't think there is a way out of that for the DOJ where they couldn't be accused of being political. I mean, don't get me wrong. These Espionage Act cases are inherently political across the board, whether or not it's Trump. I mean, just as a matter of precedent, there's a double standard. National defense information, which is the category of information under the act, as well as classified information. So the status of the document as classified actually doesn't matter for an Espionage Act case. But what we've seen historically is that folks get prosecuted for non-sensitive documents simply for talking to the press. And there's a huge double standard in how that's applied. So you open up any major newspaper of record and you'll constantly see high level leaks to the media for a variety of reasons, to either plant kind of press tests for policies that different agencies might want to pursue, both domestically and internationally. And sometimes folks just do it for personal gain or all sorts of political reasons, like career advancement or putting pressure on agencies. This is common in DC and how it works, and everyone knows it. However, the vast majority of the time, those cases are not prosecuted. Generally, the only times that they're prosecuted are when they expose misconduct or they go against a dominant policy or consensus in Washington. And those are the whistleblower cases. So those are the revelations of spying. Those are the revelations of killings of innocent civilians, like in the case of Daniel Hale, who was a drone whistleblower, alleged source for Jeremy Scale for his book on drones, and exposed how the drone program actually was not this precision program as had been described, but was indiscriminately killing civilians, and way more civilians than anyone had imagined previously. And for that, he's currently serving time behind bars. So these are the types of prosecutions that we see, which I think led to some of the comparisons between Trump and those whistleblowers. But it's really not a common case at all. It's not. Maybe they're prosecuted under the same law, but Trump is not a whistleblower. He's not even accused of communicating the documents, simply retaining them. And what he was doing is not in the public interest. I don't think there's any credible argument that he was either acting in the public interest or even trying to act in the public interest.
So just to push back a little on like the idea that the DOJ, it would have been political, because I've been hearing this narrative that runs contrary to that. I think that it would have been political for them to not prosecute Trump. Doesn't the Espionage Act, if I'm not mistaken, like doesn't it not matter if it was in the public interest? Like, didn't they rule that with Ellsberg, that when he started to make that argument, that the judge ruled that it was like, no, you can't actually use that as a defense for the Espionage Act. And so wouldn't that actually not play into whether or not Trump should be charged with the Espionage Act? And I don't know, but I've heard. So I just want to bring this up from like our boss Bob Scheer, that it's pretty common for presidents to bring home classified documents without going through the, what is it called, the National Records, or I forget what it's called, the National Archives and Records Administration, to declassify them. Like he said when he interviewed Nixon, there was classified documents kind of sprawled around the room, which I think would be, considered kind of irresponsible, having someone in your house with all those classified documents around, and yet there was no, similar standard held for Nixon or other, I'm assuming other presidents that held them in similar ways. And then you take into account like the David Petraeus, who actually revealed the names of like intelligence officers and war strategies and things like that, like actually really provably valuable classified information that got kind of slaps on the wrist. So like, while I understand your argument that it was political, it might have been political to not prosecute Trump for how reckless he was being and how much he was disobeying DOJ. But isn't there also that argument that it's to be made that it's at least equally as political to that they actually did charge him? Plus, they also kind of broke this unofficial, kind of unspoken rule that you don't really go after previous presidents for stuff like this. Like I think there, Kevin Gospel, I think it was, reported on something that I think I forgot who it was, but someone from the Bush administration basically said that Trump should not be prosecuted because we don't go after presidents like this. So how do you account for all of those things in assessing whether or not this is political to prosecute him or political not to?
To be clear, the only reason I think what would have been political not to prosecute is just because Trump forced their hand. Now, if this weren't well publicized, if Trump had actually cooperated, I think that we likely wouldn't see a prosecution here. I think the only reason that they're probably forced in part to do it was because it was well publicized that he wasn't cooperating. There was the raid of Mar-a-Lago. I think they claim that it technically wasn't a raid, but that was well publicized, and they still didn't get those documents back. And at that point, what's the DOJ going to do? So you bring up the instances of Nixon, which absolutely, I think it's part and parcel that all officials are bringing documents home. I mean, this is something that folks that were recently charged were claiming as well. And it's a common argument in these cases that this is just practice. It's not just presidents that are bringing documents home after their terms. It's literally officials across the board do that as a matter of practice. Like, these things don't get enforced. But I think with the case of Nixon, for instance, that wasn't publicized all around the country. I think the DOJ, to avoid the providing more evidence that there are double standards, needed to move forward with that prosecution. Because I think So I think it's just simply because of how well publicized it was and the degree to which he was flouting. Because I think that when an official cooperates, it gives a DOJ an out. They can say, well, there was a potential violation here, but at least we worked to a resolution. It gives a way to save face. The DOJ had no way to save face here. So when I say it's when I say it would have been political, I totally agree with everything you're saying. I just think in what happened with Trump, I think the amount of attention that it received and where he forced them strategically didn't really leave other options.
Yeah, so there was like a political pressure on the DOJ, you're saying, basically, to do this because of how publicized it was. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's really my point. I do agree there's public interest does not matter 100%, and there are double standards 100%.
Right. And do you think that the use of the Espionage Act, because that's pretty severe, right, is kind of political as well? Because, like, why not charge him with another statute in the U.S. Criminal Code? I think it's called 18 U.S. Code 1924 that specifically covers the, quote, unauthorized removal and retention of classified material, or classified information. Which I think is I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know, but you can tell me. I'm assuming that that's less severe of a charge than the Espionage Act. So do you think that would have been a more appropriate charge had it not been politically motivated?
So regarding the misuse of classified information, absolutely makes sense on the surface. I'm absolutely sure there were big debates in the DOJ about this, and it looks on the surface that it would certainly apply, and there's precedent for that. The likely reason that charge was not used is because it brings classification specifically as an element. And this was the main front that Trump was fighting on. His lawyers were creating these arguments, even if they didn't seem like credible arguments, but they were making arguments about the presidential authority to declassify documents. So if that charge were brought, it would have made the classification an issue, which meant that Trump would have had an ability to challenge that, and there would be a risk of exposing classified information or having to make that an issue. One of the key themes that we actually saw throughout our research on the book is that the DOJ does not like litigating classification. The intelligence agencies don't either, because you have this tension in which judicial processes are open to the public. That's part of due process, and that there's a right of public participation and visibility of cases, particularly criminal cases, and there'd be a strong interest for a former president. I mean, I can't think of a case where you'd want more public access, but there's a tension between that and the secrecy of documents in some cases where there's a much heightened interest in that secrecy. So courts have a number of ways to deal with this. There are things like in camera review, which are proceedings where it's just the judge and the parties. But generally, like, those aren't used liberally, especially in a case where there's a desire for public access. So I think to save the potential headache of having to either reveal more classified information or just fight this uphill battle that Trump was prepared to fight over classification, they went with a statute where classification does not matter. So classification does not appear in the Espionage Act 793. There's other parts of the Espionage Act where it does appear, but those aren't at issue here. In fact, the Espionage Act, passed in 1917, predates the classification system, which was passed in the early 1950s by executive order by several decades. Classification literally didn't exist at the time. They use a term called national defense information, which covers classified info, but it's also much broader. So I think it was strategic for them to do that because it basically wipes away this whole issue. That's why Trump and his lawyers were really stupid in the way they responded to the Espionage Act uh, inquiry, because there's all this reporting, right? Like, I think we all heard that about how Trump was arguing, oh, he's the president. He has the authority to declassify. So he waved his magic wand and he declassified the documents. Guess what? It's irrelevant because classification literally doesn't appear. So it was such a stupid argument because he was arguing something that like made no difference to the text of the law. And I think that's ultimately why they did it. So 100% I agree with you. The text of that law would appear to apply, but when you actually get to like the boots on the ground, what that court fight would look like, it's a much different fight and it's a lot messier for the DOJ. And that's probably why they didn't do it.
Oh, okay, so the Espionage Act actually gives them a much stronger case. Sorry, Diego, go ahead. You're gonna ask a question.
No, yeah, I just wanted to get back to this point of Trump, or the fact that the DOJ had to act because it was so publicized, like you said, but and that and it would have been politicized if they hadn't. But hasn't this, the media been reporting on Trump and him being investigated since 2016 with things like Russiagate and all these things kind of being piled onto him? Would this have applied to someone like a Barack Obama or like a Biden, for instance, who also possessed classified? I mean, he gave them back, right? Supposedly.
You mean, would the text of the Espionage Act cover them on paper at least?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the wording of the act is so broad. This is one of the main criticisms of the act and a push for its reform, in that it would technically cover you both as journalists for reporting.
Yeah. Okay. So sorry, I don't want to hog the whole thing from Diego. I want to get Diego in here in a second, but the so we just interviewed Kit Clarenberg recently. I don't know if you know about his case, but he was detained by British police at an airport for his reporting um, on at the Gray Zone, and we talked in that episode a lot about how the UK is kind of devolving into this censorship state that imposes state censorship and self-censorship very effectively, and how the government kind of has unchecked power in censoring journalists in the UK, that there's a law that basically makes it illegal to be in possession of classified documents. I think it was called the National Security Bill or something. And what I'm hearing now is that, like, so America, we may not in practice and in legal precedent be as bad as the UK on press freedom, but on paper and what the Espionage Act permits and seems to be now getting closer to actually doing in practice with Julian Assange and Trump, is almost or equally as bad as the UK. Is that correct, or am I exaggerating things a little bit?
I think one of the biggest risks with the act is what's called the chilling effect, which is the fear that journalists or the general public will have of being targeted under the act because of how broad it is. And that chilling effect happens when folks don't know what the limits are of using this law. Now, the language of the act is so broad, it punishes anyone who has unauthorized possession of national defense information, who communicates that with reason to believe it could be used to harm the US or benefit a foreign power. Now, that's crazy broad. Let's unpack what those words say. Unauthorized possession. So in the government's view, and this is asserted in public positions and court documents, any member of the public who doesn't have a clearance, and also folks who have a clearance who are using or keeping information in a way that their superiors don't want, has unauthorized possession. So that's easy to meet. And then national defense information covers classified information, covers secrets, doesn't even have to be classified. Reason to believe that it could injure the US, well, that is a very, very low bar. Again, historically has been very easy to meet. And then, of course, communication. There's no specific cases on this, but the plain language of communication would appear to cover publication, or at least some positive. The Justice Department would take that position if push came to shove. So that theoretically applies to anyone. So where the public and journalists are left are relying on the goodwill of prosecutors in DOJ positions in terms of who they do or don't prosecute as a matter of policy. Now, that's a policy protection. It's not a legal protection. It's not a court protection. It's not something in the law that says a journalist can't be prosecuted. And that's why there are efforts to reform the Espionage Act. Where the chilling effect comes in is because there's so much uncertainty, folks don't want to take that risk. I mean, who wants to have to deal with covering lawyers? And as a media organization, that's a big risk to take that they're calculating. What about independent journalists? Are you going to hire a criminal defense attorney to advise and then also defend a case? Or are folks just going to play it safe and not report a story? So what we generally see are trends of self-censorship as a result. And that's really the biggest risk with a overbroad law where folks are not sure what the state of play is. Now, that's on the chilling effect and the scope of how the act could be applied. In terms of the UK, historically, the UK has been aggressive in terms of going after secrets. The UK has what's called an Official Secrets Act. It's actually predating the Espionage Act. There are some debates during the passage of the Espionage Act that actually the Wilson administration and members of the DOJ wanted to try to model something after the Official Secrets Act, which imposed strict liability on not just insiders, but also publishers, on outsiders of government for dissemination of secrets, much more draconian than the Espionage Act. Now, those efforts were reined in, and the Wilson administration didn't get their Official Secrets Act. But there have been fears that due to how broadly the Espionage Act is written and how it's been increasingly interpreted and used over the years, that we're actually inching closer and closer in reality to something that looks more like an Official Secrets Act, which is a system that they have in the UK. So generally, the UK has been a lot more restrictive, a lot more aggressive in going after journalists. There have been in the past full-on raids. I believe there were raids of the Guardian offices after the Snowden disclosures. That's why when you look historically, the outlets that were publishing the Snowden documents were ones like the Washington Post. And then, of course, the Intercept was founded largely as a result to try to create a entity that wasn't under the UK jurisdiction, because generally they've been a lot more aggressive, not just in terms of using the Official Secrets Act, but also in terms of stopping folks at airports. The late David Miranda, who tragically passed away recently, is the partner of Glenn Greenwald. Following the Snowden revelations, was actually, I believe, stopped at Heathrow. This was nearly 10 years ago at this point, but was stopped at Heathrow, detained, interrogated at length. So this is the kind of stuff that happens at the border. So when I saw the story that you brought up, I was not actually not surprised at all. That seems well within the playbook, unfortunately, in the UK.
And just getting back to the Espionage Act, I'm curious. So the Obama administration was kind of the catalyst for bringing it into the 21st century. You know, it was laying dormant for a number of decades. You know, before Obama, it was used, I think, 3 times, I believe, mentioned before. And it was used in 3 subsequent administrations now. And now with Biden, you have Jack Teixeira, the Discord leaker, Robert Burcham, an Air Force intelligence officer, and Trump. Uh, what can you make of the growing, I guess, eagerness to use it that was ushered in by the Obama administration, maintained? And do you think it's like the landscape of civil liberties is quickly eroding because of this increase?
One thing I do want to unpack is when we talk about the Espionage Act being used. So you're right that there have been limited prosecutions, as in formal legal proceedings filed under the Espionage Act. But one of the things that we dive into in the book and a lot of our original research was actually there were a lot of Espionage Act investigations and internal debates, things like FBI visits, things like calls for prosecutions, things like internal analysis, surveillance under the Espionage Act in these periods where we think of them as being quiet. Because in the 1980s, for instance, under Ronald Reagan, we usually hear, okay, there's a prosecution of this big case, Samuel Morrison, who was a source for Jane's Defense Weekly, and an eccentric character. He led to this very important case that went to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is a very important court which would actually oversee the Eastern District of Virginia, where the majority of Espionage Act cases are brought. It's basically the epicenter of the defense and national security apparatus. But that case was a decisive case. So it's always talked about in these Espionage Act cases. But there were a ton more efforts to investigate and also call for prosecution of not just insiders, but also media outlets under the Reagan administration. So even though we see this rapid spike under the Obama administration and continued under Trump and now actually Biden, that is the result of something that was simmering for a long time that just came to a boil. So it wasn't like Obama showed up and just started throwing axes at the press. These were debates that were happening actually well before that. What I think really changed, or what a lot of folks observe, is that the advantage that Obama had, it started in the Bush administration, but really under Obama, and we saw confirmed in the Snowden revelations, it was a lot easier to get evidence. So under Ellsberg, right, like he physically was at a copy center with his kids scanning thousands of pages of the Pentagon Papers. You didn't have Ellsberg didn't burn stuff to a CD or take out a thumb drive. And as a result, to prove that, the FBI had to go and find papers. They didn't have to go to a ISP. They didn't have to look at the access logs of their servers. They didn't have to raid and find like USB sticks. They had to actually go and find papers. Now that's different now in that you have digital evidence, you have surveillance. So it's actually a lot easier, starting with Obama, for the government to investigate and also mount a case. There's just so many more digital traces, metadata, contacts tracing. So it just like, as a practical matter, and that even goes back to the mishandling of classified information charge and the potential for that, and why strategically it didn't make sense. The spike in Espionage Act cases, I think, is a large part due to the surveillance that we have today, the impact of our data, issues of digital privacy, which is why they're particularly important. So it's easier to mount those cases. It's easy to surveil people. Like, for instance, with the Texera case, that was a recent case where a 21-year-old analyst was accused of posting classified documents on a Discord server. Discord's basically a chat community app that is used often for gaming. And he had his small community and a following. And what I've seen the reports say is that he was trying to brag to friends, basically, of trying to say, hey, like, look at the cool stuff that I have. And folks were admiring him for that. The dissemination was limited at first, then it got picked up by media outlets. But obviously, that's an easier thing to prove. It's easier to go to a Discord server where there's that imprint than to go to Dan Ellsberg's home and try to find a stack of papers. I mean, that's doable too, but it's just miles easier. So I think that's one of the reasons for the escalation that we see. And in terms of,
Oh, also, Carey, sorry to interrupt, but does that also make the kind of like, after these documents are leaked, and it seems that like with a tactic of the establishment when there's a whistleblower is to smear the personality and make it about the personal life of the whistleblower or the leaker. Like in Daniel Ellsberg's case, they broke into his psychiatrist's office and tried to find psychosexual secrets about him that would make him seem like a pervert or whatever. And so that increased surveillance also makes that element of things easier, right? Because now you don't have to go break into someone's psychiatrist's office to find out their psychosexual secrets. You can just put, I'm sure that there are ways, right, to like probably see their psychosexual secrets or some other damning part of their personality through the internet surveillance, right?
and 100%, and we've seen that with a number of defendants. It happens really often, actually, where you correctly point out how Ellsberg's personality was smeared, and not only by officials, but by media outlets at the time. I mean, we talk about some of these in our book, but there were headlines in the Times about how Ellsberg was cruising in Malibu with different women in his sports cars. And I mean, this was more gossip than it was substance about his case. I mean, he was facing life in prison, but there were still efforts to smear him personally. We see that in the way that Julian Assange has been reported. We see that about Edward Snowden. There's really an attempt to make these cases about the individual rather than the issues. And it's really a deflection. I mean, to government's credit, it's smart, it works, because folks become less sympathetic. So it's harder to promote public support. It complicates the issues because then folks don't want to associate with someone for whatever reason. And it also makes it harder to fundraise for their legal defense. So there are a lot of practical practical harms that it does for folks' defense. But you're absolutely right that these prosecutions are not that they are multifaceted. They're not single faceted. And I think that really brings us to what I feel is one of the most important things to realize about these cases, these Espionage Act cases, specifically against insiders and whistleblowers, is that they're designed to ruin lives and send a message. I mean, ultimately, in these cases, and kind of going back to the politics of a case, I mean, ultimately, there's a political goal, like, and that is a broader strategic objective with any prosecution. There's going to be a strategic objective of whether or not that is enforcing a policy, whether it's sending a message, whether it's to serve as a deterrent. And largely, the government in these Espionage Act cases wants it to stop. They don't want whistleblowers. They don't want folks talking to the press. I mean, that's the strategic objective. So how do you get there? You send a message. You nail people to a cross. What does that look like? Well, it looks like bringing a prosecution and having potential criminal charges. It also means making that prosecution messy. So it's not some easy misdemeanor. It's dozens of felony counts. It's a very difficult case and costly case to defend. And you also smear them personally. So then it sends a message about the next whistleblower, the next Dan Ellsberg, the late Dan Ellsberg, who recently passed. For the next one that comes along, they're going to think twice. Do I want to take that risk? Do I want to deal with all of that? Is it worth going to the press and my life being completely ruined as a result? And I promise you, a lot of folks think twice. I think that strategy is effective, whether or not the court case actually succeeds, which most of the time it does, either because someone pleads out or because they have the hammer brought down on them because the odds are stacked against them. But it is not a good outcome in those cases. And I promise you, folks are seeing that and thinking twice because they don't want the same thing to happen to them.
Isn't it ironic also that the press engages, like you mentioned, this kind of gossip? And even in the case of Jack Teixeira, like, they even, kind of helped the FBI find him, even though the revelation of these, something like WikiLeaks brings them prestige and respect to an extent.
I think the press is certainly in many ways complicit in those strategies because, and I don't have to tell you, especially coming at this from as members of more independent media that aren't part necessarily of that establishment press, there's a lot more political consideration that main outlets are taking. So on one hand, they have an interest in not being prosecuted, and they have a very strong interest in defending these cases because the precedents that get set directly impact them. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, they're playing a delicate game because, especially for big outlets, they have a lot of access, right? Like they have access to the administration, they have access to officials. So they're in those rooms, they're in those conversations, there are negotiations. So they're trying to toe this line between protecting their rights on paper, but also not doing things that are alienating the very officials. Because they're making money, they're getting clout. They want that access. So I think that's why we see some of the things we see, because they're trying to basically cover themselves, but not do it so much that they alienate the establishment that they're trying to cover. So I think that's why we see this trend. It's really fascinating, actually, just from a kind of human behavior standpoint. Going back to Ellsberg, like he gave the New York Times one of the biggest scoops that they had in their history. I mean, the Pentagon Papers were huge. And for folks that were around then, it was absolutely huge. I mean, the Vietnam War was the issue of the time, and it completely fractured the country. And here these disclosures came out, total bombshells. And yet, despite that, they threw their source under the bus. They didn't want to contribute to his defense. And not just that, they're running stories smearing him, which made it objectively harder for him to defend himself. So, I mean, it's really, really wild. We see that actually with a lot of the modern cases too. A lot of the folks that were prosecuted under Obama, that were prosecuted under Trump, their media outlets didn't help them either. This is a recurring trend where either they get thrown under the bus or the media outlets careless and either inadvertently discloses the source to an agency, doesn't protect their sources, or in the worst case is writing really nasty things about either sources or partners. So I think you're absolutely right pointing out that trend. It's really disappointing. It makes things quite complicated. We give many more examples of that actually in the book, of how the media has been a very complicated actor in all these Espionage Act cases over the years.
To wrap things up, some people who support this indictment claim that it's in the name of validating the rule of law and an example of how even the most powerful people can be held accountable. I disagree personally because of the like double standards that we've already mentioned. That it just, I can't, like, to me, like, I feel that for laws that have the potential to put you in jail for the rest of your life to have credibility, they need to be applied, you know, equally and consistently, not in specific moments. So for me, that, I don't agree with that argument, but it is a case being made. And you've also explained here how Trump was especially reckless. So it could have been, it can be perceived as political for them to not prosecute him. And this is specifically mentioned by the New York Times White House correspondent Peter Baker, this kind of idea. So what are your thoughts on this take? Do you agree with it or no?
I think Trump got preferential treatment.
Yeah.
With past cases, with the Obama cases, with the Trump cases, folks did not have a back and forth dialogue like that. They just didn't have the chances to return documents, to cooperate. I think if there were equal justice and equal application of the law, he would have been indicted the second those documents were discovered. Same with Biden and Clinton. Those are facial violations, and folks have been prosecuted for less. So there is already a degree of preferential treatment. I don't think that even with the outcome of Trump getting charged, the way that we get there was the result of a lot of preferential treatment. Absolutely. And that doesn't even get to anything else that we don't know about in terms of what Trump was doing with those documents, which so far we haven't seen formal allegations of, but there's all other types of issues that I believe Trump was also accused of during his administration in terms of relationships, for instance, relationships with the Saudis, relationships with other countries. And this gets into really sticky territory. And I think some that needs to be scrutinized, which is the way that different officials are brokering access and information with their ties abroad, because that certainly happens. It certainly happens. I mean, we're seeing that there are a lot of counters. I think another counter we see is with Hunter Biden. There's a lot of controversy surrounding that. I mean, that's mostly used as a rallying cry from the right. So it's kind of strange bedfellows to get into some of that. But I'd be very interested to see to what extent access to information and communication of information that could be seen as national defense information applies in that case. So I don't celebrate the Trump case as a victory for the rule of law. If anything, I think it's quite the opposite. I think what we're seeing now is folks are flocking to interest in the Espionage Act, and also I think folks like the Espionage Act. Maybe not everyone, but I do think that folks like the outcome of justice for Trump. So they're going to cheer the weapon that's being used. I just think that's natural. I think the means are not scrutinized, but it's it's a very double-edged sword. I mean, this is a, for lack of a better summary, this is a very bad tool for a good outcome. This is a bad tool, because the last thing we need is for the Espionage Act to be legitimized. There have been constant efforts to try to reform this law out of public interest defense. There have been concrete amendments brought by lawmakers like Rashida Tlaib and others like Senator Wyden have supported reform. There have been tangible efforts and pushes on both sides of the political spectrum, right and left, from legal academics, practitioners, to reform this law. It's a bad law. So legitimizing it is actually a step backwards. I think it's actually bad for the rule of law, because then the next whistleblower case that comes along, folks are going to say like, well, it was used against Trump, so it must be being used fairly because it was used against a former president. But to pardon my language, but it's total bullshit. I was actually disappointed to see the act and scared for what that means for future whistleblowers.
Yeah, we were actually going to ask you a question about that, if it would legitimize the prosecution of future whistleblowers under the Espionage Act, or even like in Assange's case, because he might be extradited soon. Yeah, so it seems that, because I was going to kind of put it to you in a black and white way of saying, like, is this a step, even with the preferential treatment, is this a step in the right direction to have a president being held accountable, quote unquote, for something? Or is it a step towards a banana republic sort of thing where people are kind of just prosecuted for political reasons and laws are applied unequally? And it seems like it's a more nuanced kind of answer than that. But at the end of the day, this use of the Espionage Act is actually, whether or not you support the outcome of actually getting Trump punished for some of the illegal things that he's done, is very dangerous for the future, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and at the end of the day even if you subscribe to the view that it's somehow justice or equal application for the rule of law, if the ultimate goal is holding Trump accountable or getting him having some negative outcome like that, that's why I can only think the DOJ was forced into a corner, because this isn't for me. I don't think folks in the DOJ are necessarily celebrating. Like, this is a mess. Like, his poll numbers are going up, his gap with other Republicans is widening. The right overwhelmingly thinks it's a political prosecution, so he's being cast as a martyr. It's a terrible look for the Biden administration. I mean, it reeks that it's political. I'm sure that calculation was all made. So, and also, he's not going to see the inside of a jail cell.
Yeah, because and he has the legal resources to like extend this to, if he won the presidency, he could pardon himself, right?
There'd be a lot of novel questions that I couldn't answer now, but I do think that there is a lot of access. I mean, his lawyers suck, and even if his lawyers give him good advice, he's not gonna. I mean, he just fires whoever does things he doesn't like, and he ends up with folks that are incompetent. Because one of my first reactions was, awesome, we're gonna have a showdown under the Espionage Act with like a billionaire backing the legal defense and the best lawyers in the country. And I was talking to somebody, and their reaction was, "You obviously haven't seen his lawyers." And I thought about it, and I was like, "Oh shit, actually, like, they have been incompetent." And that's what sucks, actually. Like, we might get worse precedent if it goes to court, but I don't know that it really is. I mean, this is happening, this is operating such a high level. We could very well see some sort of deal, or I mean, Petraeus, right? He got a deal, he got a slap on the wrist. And that was Petraeus. Here we have Trump. So what does a deal there look like? What does a negotiation look like? I don't know, but the outcome of him being in jail, of him having some sort of penalty, of him even actually not becoming president, I don't know that we're gonna see those outcomes. So part of me is wondering, like, what's the point?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Carey, for joining us. I think that's a great place to end it. If you want to tell people where they can find your work and your buy your book and everything.
Absolutely. So I co-authored recently a book with a media historian, respected media historian, Ralph Engelman. And our book is titled A Century of Repression, the Espionage Act and Freedom of the Press. Again, it's A Century of Repression, and that's with the University of Illinois Press. It's available with most major booksellers. And we talk about the whole 100-year history, political history, namely, of the Espionage Act. So for folks that are interested in journalism and US history, contemporary history, and also these issues, I recommend it, not because I co-authored it, but because I think in our research and the stories that we tell about people, it's not just about the law, but about people in these administrations. We really hope that it can be of interest to anyone interested in these issues or those touching them.
All right,
Great.
great.
And
yeah, go ahead,
yeah, and
Max.
we'll link to the book. And yeah, thank you for joining us, Carey.
Thanks,
Yeah, thank you
Carey.
so much for having me.